the fall of 1894, the fields outside a small Oklahoma settlement looked like any other stretch of farmland. Low grass curling in the wind, the faint outline of railroad tracks carving through the soil, and rows of canvas tents where migrant workers slept after long days of labor. Yet it was here, on these flat and silent plains, that men began to vanish, not in the dead of night, as one might expect, but in the pale hours of dawn, just as the first light touched the horizon. In 1894, Oklahoma was still young, raw, and unsettled, a place caught between the old frontier and the march of progress. Only 7 years had passed since the first great land run had opened its soil to eager settlers, and the prairie remained scarred by the rush of wagons and men claiming every stretch of earth they could stake. Small towns sprouted almost overnight, little more than clusters of clapboard buildings, a church, a saloon, and a row of tents serving as temporary homes. The land itself was unforgiving, vast fields of tall grass that rippled like water under the wind, rivers that could vanish into drought or swell into floods, and skies that seemed to press down on the earth, trapping everything beneath a restless horizon. For those who came here, life was both a gamble and a burden. Every acre promised prosperity but demanded backbreaking labor, and every decision carried the shadow of failure. The settlement near the shadow fields was no different. Farmers had carved narrow plots into the prairie, while railroad companies pressed their way through, hiring men in droves to clear brush, lay track, and move supplies. The work was harsh, paid little, and offered even less security. But men arrived from every direction: Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, drawn by the possibility of wages in a land that promised to grow into something bigger. They slept in makeshift camps, canvas stretched against crude wooden frames, with fires burning low at night as they cooked whatever scraps they could afford. Days began before dawn, the workers rising stiff from the ground, wiping grit from their eyes, and trudging out with tools slung over their shoulders. By the time the sun broke fully, the fields were alive with the sound of saws, hammers, and the rhythmic pound of rail ties. The mornings carried their own peculiar atmosphere. Oklahoma dawns in those years were unlike any other time of day, cloaked in heavy mist that rolled low across the ground. To some, the fog was simply weather, a natural companion to the shifting seasons. But to the men who worked there, it became a presence, swallowing the edges of the field, obscuring figures only a few yards away, and muting sound until a shout could seem to vanish before reaching another's ear. The land, though open and endless, felt strangely close in those hours, as if something unseen pressed against the camp. The locals, who had settled longer, often remarked that dawn was when the prairie revealed its true self, quiet, watchful, and unwelcoming to strangers. It was in this environment that unease began to grow. The combination of isolation, brutal work, and the suffocating silence of the land weighed on the men, and their stories carried an edge of dread even before anyone went missing. They spoke of the way the horizon seemed to shift in the early light, as if the line between sky and earth blurred into something uncertain. They told of long dark shapes moving through the grass, always just beyond clear sight, and of hearing voices when none of their fellows were near. It was an unforgiving place, but one that gave men no choice but to endure, for the land itself promised wages, and perhaps in time, a piece of it to call their own. And so every day they rose again at dawn, unaware of what waited for them in the pale light of the shadow fields. The men who came to those fields in 1894 were not men of wealth or station, but drifters, farmers' sons, and wanderers who had little to lose and everything to gain by following the scent of wages. They were the lifeblood of expansion, nameless hands hired to cut through brush, drive rail ties, and haul timber, their labor feeding the ambitions of railroad companies and land speculators who would never know their names. Most carried little more than the clothes on their backs, a tin cup and a blanket to spread on the ground at night. Some had wives and children waiting in towns far away, sending their pay home when they could. Others had run from debts, the law, or broken promises, finding in Oklahoma a chance to disappear and start again. They lived together in crude camps pitched on the edges of the prairie, tents stitched from canvas patched so many times they let the wind whistle through. Life in the camps was a mixture of camaraderie and suspicion. The men drank together, sang songs around the fire, and told stories of where they had come from. tales of Arkansas farms, Kentucky hollows, and Texas cattle drives. But beneath the laughter was an unease born of scarcity and desperation. Wages were meager, the work was brutal, and fights often broke out over rations, over cards, or over nothing at all. A man might share his bread one night and pull a knife the next. Still, for all their differences, they depended on one another. A worker injured on the job could only rely on his bunkmates to drag him from the field and patch his wounds, for there were no doctors paid to watch over laborers. In such conditions, bonds formed quickly, even among men who would never have crossed paths under other circumstances. The morning ritual was always the same. Before dawn, the camp stirred with coughs and the low shuffle of boots on hard earth. Men would groan awake, rub the stiffness from their joints, and gather around a pot of weak coffee or a skillet of beans cooked the night before. Their tools, axes and hammers and shovels, leaned against tree stumps or rail posts, waiting to be carried into the fields. As the horizon lightened, the men rose in groups, stepping into the mist together, their voices fading as they disappeared into the fog. It was in these fragile moments, between darkness and daylight, that something strange began to take hold. At first, no one noticed the absences. Men moved often in those days, leaving without warning to chase rumors of better pay, or simply drifting to another camp when work slowed. But soon patterns emerged. A man who had shared a fire with his bunkmates the night before would fail to return from the fields. His bedroll lay untouched, his boots left behind, and sometimes even his pay tucked safely in a tin under the cot. Others swore they saw their companions only moments before, stepping into the mist with tools in hand, only for the fog to thin and reveal nothing but open ground. The disappearances began to gnaw at the edges of the workers' nerves. Some whispered that the land itself took men when it wanted, that the earth was hungry, swallowing them whole at dawn. Others muttered about shadows in the fields, shapes that moved with purpose but left no sound, luring men deeper into the mist. Whatever the cause, fear began to seep into the camp, quiet at first but spreading with each new absence, until every man rose at dawn with a wary glance at the horizon, wondering if he would return by nightfall. The disappearances quickly became the marrow of local gossip, weaving themselves into the rhythm of daily life in the nearby settlement. At first, the talk was cautious, spoken only in back rooms of the saloon or whispered along the pews of the little clapboard church. Folks had heard of men drifting off before, rail hands abandoning contracts, farm workers chasing rumors of silver or oil, but the strangeness of these vanishings could not be ignored. Too many belongings left behind, too many sudden gaps where familiar faces had stood only the day before. It was not long before explanations began to grow, some grounded in fear, others in superstition, until it seemed everyone had their own version of what haunted the fields. The most persistent stories spoke of shadows. Men and women alike claimed that in the early hours, just as the fog rolled heavy over the prairie, they saw shapes stretching longer than any sunrise should allow. Ordinary shadows thrown by the low sun seemed to warp and twist, pulling across the grass in strange directions as though cast by something unseen. A farmwife walking to fetch water at dawn swore she saw her own shadow split from her body and move ahead of her, gliding across the mist like a separate being. Another settler, an old veteran of the war, told anyone who'd listened that he had seen 3 figures moving in the fields at first light, figures too tall, their limbs stretched impossibly long, vanishing when he shouted. The workers themselves were divided. Some laughed it off as nerves or the product of bad whiskey, but others grew wary, refusing to leave camp until the sun stood higher in the sky. They claimed to hear things in the mist, faint voices carried on the wind, sometimes calling names that belonged to men who were no longer alive. One man, a cook for the crew, insisted that he heard Thomas Harlan's voice, the first to vanish, calling to him from the fields days after his disappearance. "Clear as yours," he said, trembling before his companions. He called my name, but when I looked, there was nothing but the fog and the grass moving. Locals, hardened by years on the prairie, reached further back for their answers. Some recalled old Indian warnings, stories told by tribes long before the land rush began. They spoke of places where the ground was thin, where the boundary between the living and the dead could shift with the light of day. The shadow fields, they said, were such a place. Others, more practical, whispered of outlaws, of killers who struck at dawn when the mist could hide their crimes, dragging their victims into shallow graves. But even those who clung to this explanation could not account for the strangeness described again and again. Men seen moments before they vanished, shadows that moved against the light, and the chilling sense that the land itself was watching. As the story spread, the fields began to take on a name of their own. What had once been simply another stretch of farmland was now spoken of in hushed tones, called cursed ground. Families warned their children to keep away from the mist at sunrise, and laborers, though desperate for pay, began to carry charms or mutter prayers before setting foot beyond camp. The land, once a promise of livelihood, now carried a reputation that clung like fog to every dawn. The accounts that surfaced from those who lived closest to the shadow fields were a tangled weave of fear, disbelief, and reluctant confession. For the most part, people did not want to talk. In communities so small, where every word could circle back to its speaker, admitting to strange sights or sounds was an invitation to ridicule. Yet the stories still slipped through cracks, carried by those who could no longer keep silent or by those who wanted their neighbors to know the truth of what they had seen. The first came from the workers themselves. One laborer told of walking with 3 others into the mist at dawn, their silhouettes lined up evenly, their tools glinting in the pale light. He swore that when the fog thinned for only a heartbeat, the man beside him was simply gone. No cry, no sound of footsteps, nothing disturbed in the grass. The others searched frantically, calling out until their throats burned. But the field lay silent and empty, as though the earth had swallowed their companion whole. From the nearby settlement, there were reports of figures glimpsed from a distance. A farmer riding past at daybreak claimed he saw a group of men moving steadily into the field, each one casting a shadow that stretched impossibly long, sliding over the ground like ink spilling in water. He raised his hand to wave, but the men did not respond, and when the mist shifted, they were gone. He later admitted that he did not know if the figures were truly there, or if the light had played tricks on him, but the unease in his voice never left. One of the most chilling testimonies came from a widow who lived in a small cabin on the edge of the prairie. She told of hearing voices at sunrise, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the fog. They were men's voices, low and tired, speaking words she could not make out. At first, she thought it was the workers making their way to the fields. But when she stepped onto her porch, she saw nothing but the shifting gray of the mist. The voices grew louder, circling her home until she retreated inside, clutching her rosary. When asked later if she might have been dreaming, she shook her head firmly and said she was as awake as she had ever been in her life. Even the local children contributed their share of haunting observations. A boy, no older than 10, told of seeing a man standing in the fog with a hat pulled low, staring across the field. When he tried to approach, the figure turned and walked deeper into the mist. The boy followed only a few paces before realizing that the man's feet left no tracks in the damp grass. Terrified, he ran home and refused to go near the fields again. These accounts, scattered and uncertain, were often dismissed by outsiders as products of nerves, exhaustion, or imagination sharpened by fear. Yet the consistency of certain details, the lengthening shadows, the vanishing figures, the voices in the mist, gave them weight. Each story layered atop the last, painting a picture of a place where ordinary rules faltered at the first light of day, where men could walk into the fog and never be seen again. When the matter of the disappearances reached the attention of the authorities, the response was slow, muted, and ultimately unsatisfying to those who lived in the shadow of the fields. The county sheriff, a stout man named Elias Turner, rode out to the camps only after repeated requests from the foreman and townsfolk, and even then he carried the air of a man convinced his time was being wasted. Turner had seen men drift before. The railroads and farms relied on transient labor, and it was not uncommon for workers to vanish overnight in search of higher wages or to flee debts that followed them from one state to the next. To him, the stories of men vanishing into mist, leaving their boots and coins behind, were nothing more than campfire talk, the result of fatigue and too much cheap whiskey. He walked the grounds, asked a few perfunctory questions, and left with a shrug, telling the foreman to keep better watch over his men. Yet beneath the official dismissal, there was a growing unrest among the townsfolk. They pointed out details the sheriff ignored: the untouched pay stubs, the tools left leaning against fence posts. The fact that many of the men had no reason to abandon steady wages when the coming winter made work scarce elsewhere. Some whispered that Turner wanted to avoid drawing attention to the problem, fearing that news of vanishings might scare away the labor force the town depended upon. The local economy was fragile, and every hired hand who arrived with a shovel or axe in tow represented survival. To admit that men were being swallowed by the land at dawn was to invite ruin. The deputy, a younger man named Samuel Pike, was less quick to dismiss the accounts. He listened carefully to the testimonies of those who claimed to have seen shadows moving or voices echoing in the fog, scribbling notes even as his superior rolled his eyes. Pike himself had been raised on the prairie and understood the strange tricks the land could play, but he also knew that too many stories were surfacing to ignore. Still, his efforts to investigate deeper were stifled. Without the sheriff's backing, he had no authority to press further, and the county judge, eager to maintain the illusion of order, refused to allocate resources to what he deemed superstition. This lack of action only emboldened the rumors. Workers who remained in the camps spoke openly of their mistrust, convinced that the law had turned its back on them. Some accused the sheriff of knowing more than he let on, perhaps even of hiding crimes committed by men with powerful ties. Others suspected that outlaws or drifters had taken to preying on the camps, confident that no authority would pursue them so long as the disappearances could be explained away as desertion. The result was a growing paranoia. Men began to sleep in pairs, posted lookouts at dawn, and carried knives tucked into their belts when they set out into the fields. Despite these precautions, the vanishings continued. Each new absence sharpened the anger toward the authorities, who seemed more interested in silencing discussion than in finding the truth. For the families of the missing, who sent letters from distant states asking why their sons, brothers, and husbands had not written back, the silence from Oklahoma officials was deafening. Their grief and uncertainty fueled a lasting resentment, one that lingered long after the camps fell silent and the fields earned their cursed name. The turning point in the story of the Shadow Fields came not from rumor or whispers, but from the cold evidence pulled from the ground itself. It began with a rancher named Matthew Crane, who had been working the edge of his property where it bordered the fields. His plow struck something hard, jolting the mule and breaking the blade. At first he cursed, thinking it was a buried stump or a rock, but when he bent to clear the soil, his hand brushed against fabric. With more digging, the fabric revealed itself to be part of a shirt, tattered, mud-stained, and wrapped around what was unmistakably human bone. Word spread quickly, drawing neighbors, workers, and eventually the authorities back to the site. What they uncovered that day silenced much of the earlier dismissal. The grave was shallow, barely more than a thin covering of dirt scattered over the remains, as if whoever had placed the body there had been in haste. A jawbone jutted up, teeth still intact, the sockets of the skull filled with earth. Nearby, buttons, a rusted belt buckle, and the torn sole of a boot were found, items that were quickly recognized as belonging to one of the missing laborers. The discovery shook the community, for it was no longer possible to claim that the men had simply wandered away. Something violent had happened, and it had happened close enough for anyone to stumble across it. As others searched, more grim findings surfaced. Just beyond the first grave, another patch of disturbed earth yielded a second set of bones. This time, the body appeared twisted, as though dragged into place, its limbs bent unnaturally beneath the soil. A few yards farther, a third burial was uncovered, and with it a small leather pouch containing coins that had been recorded as pay for one of the vanished men. Each find layered dread upon dread, transforming suspicion into certainty. The disappearances were not accidents, nor were they desertions. They were deaths, hidden in plain sight beneath the prairie. The condition of the remains deepened the mystery. Many appeared mangled, not in the manner of a clean killing, but as though they had been pulled, torn, or twisted by some unseen force. There were no clear signs of gunfire, no blade marks that would speak of a killer's knife. Instead, the bodies seemed contorted, left in positions that baffled those who dug them up. Some swore the bones bore the marks of dragging, as if the men had been hauled across the ground before being discarded into hurried graves. The lack of care in the burials suggested not reverence, but a desperate need to cover something quickly, as though the fields themselves demanded silence. The discoveries ignited fear that bled into fury, Workers demanded answers, and townsfolk pressed the sheriff for explanations he could no longer brush aside. Yet for all the physical evidence, no one could explain how so many men had vanished without witnesses, and why the graves seemed to mock any ordinary understanding of violence. The shadow fields had given up its dead, but with them came more questions than resolutions. What had moved through those mist-laden mornings? Who or what had laid the men into the earth in such twisted repose? And why, with each body unearthed, did the fields seem to grow more restless under the weight of human hands disturbing their soil? As years passed, the events of 1894 slipped from official memory, but they never left the minds of those who had lived in the settlement or worked the surrounding land. The newspapers gave little attention to the vanishings, and county records remained silent, as if the tragedy had been deliberately buried alongside the men themselves. Historians later suggested that the silence was intentional. Oklahoma was still building its reputation as fertile land for settlers. Investors and railroads and stories of men disappearing at dawn would do nothing but tarnish the promise of progress. The authorities chose not to acknowledge what had happened, and so the shadow fields became not a case in the archives, but a tale whispered from one generation to the next. Among the locals, however, the memory lived vividly. Families told their children not to wander into the fields when the morning fog rolled low, repeating the caution as firmly as one might warn against snakes or rivers in flood. Old-timers described the sensation of unease that clung to the land, the way the grass never seemed to grow as evenly where the graves had once been found, and how livestock balked when driven too close to the mist. Some claimed they could still hear voices there, low murmurs that rose when the sun first touched the horizon, fading before anyone could catch their words. Others swore that shadows lingered longer in that place, stretching unnaturally across the soil long after the light had changed. Folklore wrapped itself tightly around the story, reshaping the disappearances into something larger, more spectral. By the turn of the century, the missing workers were no longer just victims of some nameless violence, but restless spirits bound to the earth. Campfire tales told of laborers trudging forever into the fog, their faces hollow, their eyes fixed on a point no living soul could see. Children dared one another to step into the fields at dawn, only to run shrieking back at the first rustle of wind through the grass. For some, the story became a lesson in caution, an allegory about greed, expansion, and the risks men took in search of fortune. For others, it was evidence of a land that had never wanted to be taken, a place still resisting the intrusion of settlers, even as towns rose around it. Over time, the shadow fields became a name etched into the cultural memory of the region. Though maps never marked it, and outsiders often dismissed it as nothing more than prairie like any other, locals could point to it without hesitation, their voices lowering as though the place itself might overhear. Historians who visited decades later noted the persistence of the tale, fascinated by how a few missing workers had transformed into an enduring legend. The land remained unsettled, the stories unresolved, but the fear endured. In that persistence lay the truest legacy of the shadow fields, not the silence of official record, but the unbroken thread of memory carried through generations, ensuring that even when the facts blurred, the dread they inspired never faded. As the mist lifts from the fields and the story of 1894 fades into the darkness of memory, one truth lingers: the shadow fields have never given back all their secrets. Men rose at dawn and never returned, their belongings left behind, their voices swallowed by the fog. Were they victims of human cruelty, buried hastily in shallow graves? Or did something older, something nameless, move across that prairie when the first light touched the earth? These are the questions history will not answer for us. But you, listening now, can help keep the story alive. What do you believe happened in those fields at sunrise? Were the vanishings the work of desperate hands hiding their crimes? Or could the locals have been right to fear that the land itself was claiming what it was owed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every theory adds another layer to the mystery, another attempt to pierce through the silence of the past. If these shadows have unsettled you, if the weight of forgotten tragedies calls you to look deeper into the dark corners of history, then join us. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that official records left buried, and step with us into the places where truth and terror blur. The shadow fields are only one of many. There are more voices, more mysteries, and more nights where history refuses to rest. The question is, are you ready to walk with us into the fog again?